In 480 BCE, one of the largest armies of the ancient world marched toward Greece. At its head was Xerxes I, ruler of the powerful Persian Empire. Standing in its path was a small Greek force led by King Leonidas of Sparta. Their battlefield was a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. What happened there would become one of the most famous last stands in history. But the real story is more fascinating than the legend. Because it wasn't simply 300 Spartans against an entire army. It was a desperate battle for time, position, and survival. The Persian invasion. The conflict began with a much larger struggle. The Persian Empire had already fought the Greeks years earlier. In 490 BCE, Persian forces were defeated at Marathon by the Athenians. Xerxes later decided to launch a much larger invasion. His army crossed into Greece with enormous resources behind it. The Persians had infantry, cavalry, supplies, and a powerful navy. For the Greek city-states, the danger was enormous. Greece was not a single united country. Athens, Sparta, and other city-states often competed with one another. But the Persian invasion forced many of them to cooperate. They needed a place where a smaller force could slow the Persian advance. They found it at Thermopylae. Why Thermopylae mattered? Thermopylae was a narrow passage between mountains and the sea. This geography was crucial. The Persian army might have been much larger, but only a limited number of soldiers could fight effectively in such a narrow space. The Greeks could therefore reduce the Persian numerical advantage. Their plan was simple: hold the pass for as long as possible. The longer the Persians were delayed, the more time the rest of Greece had to prepare. Leonidas was chosen to lead the Greek defenders. He brought 300 Spartan citizens with him. But this is where the famous legend needs correcting. The defenders were not only Spartans. Other Greek forces also fought at Thermopylae. The 300 Spartans became famous because they formed Leonidas's personal contingent, and because of their final sacrifice. The first attack. When the Persian army arrived, Xerxes expected the Greeks to surrender. They refused. The Persian forces attacked. But the narrow battlefield worked against them. Greek heavy infantry fought in tightly organized formations. Their large shields protected them. Their long spears allowed them to strike while maintaining formation. The Persians could not easily surround them. Attack after attack failed to break the Greek line. Even elite Persian troops struggled to force their way through the pass. For 2 days, the Greeks held their position. The Persian army was enormous. But at Thermopylae, size was not enough. Then a local Greek named Ephialtes changed everything. The secret path. Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that allowed the Persians to move around the Greek position. Suddenly, the Greeks were in danger of being attacked from behind. Leonidas realized that Thermopylae could no longer be defended. Many Greek soldiers were ordered to withdraw. But Leonidas and his remaining warrior stayed. The mission was no longer to win. It was to delay the Persian army. And that decision created one of history's most famous last stands. The final stand. The remaining Greek defenders fought knowing they were surrounded. Leonidas was killed. The fighting continued around his body. The Greeks eventually retreated to a smaller defensive position. The Persians surrounded them. The final resistance was destroyed. Thermopylae had fallen. The Persians had won the battle. But the story was far from over. What happened next? Xerxes continued his advance. Athens was abandoned. The Persian army entered the city and destroyed parts of it. It seemed as though Greece might fall. But the Greek resistance had not been destroyed. The next major turning point came at sea. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greek navy confronted the Persian fleet in narrow waters. Once again, geography became a weapon. The large Persian fleet could not use its full numerical advantage. The Greeks won. The Persian invasion began to lose momentum. The following year, the Greeks achieved another major victory at Plataea. The Persian invasion of mainland Greece was ultimately defeated. The truth about the 300. For centuries, Thermopylae has been remembered as the story of 300 Spartans. But the reality was more complicated. Thousands of Greek soldiers were involved during the battle. Spartans were only one part of the defending force. The Persians also included many different peoples and military units from across their enormous empire. And the Persian army was probably not the impossibly gigantic force, sometimes described in ancient or modern retellings. Ancient sources give enormous numbers, but historians continue to debate the actual size. So the real story is not about an impossibly small group defeating an impossibly large army. The real story is about a Greek coalition using a narrow battlefield to slow a powerful empire. Why Leonidas mattered? Leonidas knew that his position had become almost impossible to defend. Yet he stayed. Why? Part of the answer lies in Spartan military culture. Honor, discipline, and duty were deeply important. But there was also strategy. The Greeks needed time. Every hour the Persians spent fighting at Thermopylae was time the other Greek forces could use to prepare. Leonidas's decision, therefore, had meaning beyond the battlefield. His army was sacrificing itself, while the wider Greek resistance reorganized. The legacy of Thermopylae. Thermopylae became famous because of the courage of the defenders. But its greatest importance comes from what happened afterward. The battle did not defeat Persia. The Persians won. But Thermopylae became part of a larger Greek resistance that eventually stopped Xerxes' invasion. The story also became a symbol of sacrifice. Leonidas and his soldiers knew that they faced overwhelming odds. They stayed anyway. And that is why their story survived for more than 2,000 years. The real story. Thermopylae is often described as 300 Spartans versus millions of Persians. But history is rarely that simple. There were thousands of Greek defenders. There were strategic decisions. There were other battles. There were mistakes. There was geography. And there was a much larger war happening beyond the famous mountain pass. The Spartans did not win Thermopylae. They died there. But their sacrifice became part of a resistance that eventually helped save the independence of the Greek city-states. And that makes the story even more powerful. Because the meaning of Thermopylae was never simply victory. It was resistance. The final lesson. More than 2,000 years later, the battlefield of Thermopylae still reminds us of one simple truth. Sometimes a battle can be lost, while the larger struggle is still being won. Leonidas and his men could not stop the Persian Empire alone. But they stood in the path of its advance. They bought time. They became a symbol. And their final stand became one of the most remembered moments of ancient history. The 300 Spartans did not defeat Persia. They simply refused to surrender. And sometimes, that is enough to make history remember your name. This was history uncovered. Thermopylae was not the story of 300 men winning a war. It was the story of men who knew they might die, and chose to stand anyway.